We're going to be able to get through a couple of the witnesses tonight, and then next week we'll look at some other witnesses to the Old Testament canon. Now, these witnesses come in a variety of ways. In the first place, we can have a witness that gives us a mention of the 1, 2, or 3 divisions of the Old Testament canon. And there we have a witness to the canon. If we find a reference in someone's writing to the law or to the prophets or to the writings, then there is what we call a witness to the Old Testament canon. It can come secondly, like in the first place, a mention of these 1, 2, or 3 divisions of the Old Testament canon, along with the number of books in each one. A third way that a witness can be found is a mention of 1, 2, or 3 of these divisions, or you don't have to have a mention of the divisions here, and have the names of the books themselves recorded. Now we're getting better as we go along. The first one was simply a mention of the divisions of the Old Testament canon, but that doesn't witness to any particular books because we don't know which books the writer of that statement would include under that division. I mean, he might say law, but does he really mean the 5 books of Moses that we mean? Well, we wouldn't know unless he tells us which books he means, or unless he's in the main line of thought, and we'd know, well, obviously, he refers to the 5 books of Moses when he says the law. The second place, we have the divisions mentioned, but we have also the number of books in that particular division that he mentions, which even is more important for us because it lets us know at least what is the possibility of books being here. If he says the law and he says there's 4 books there, then we know we're in trouble as far as what we think about the law. But if he says that he's talking about the law and he mentions that there are 5 books in the law, that helps us out. The third place, it even helps us more if this witness gives us the names of the books. And then fourthly, another source of witnesses is the quotation of material from a book in another book or writing. And it doesn't have to be all of it. It can just be some of it. And if he says that this is done, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet Isaiah, and then goes on to quote something, and we can take that quotation wherever it's found, whether it's New Testament, whether it's Old Testament, whether it's early church fathers, and then go back to Isaiah and find that book, and there's a witness to Isaiah being a part of the Old Testament canon. So in one of these 4 ways, a mentioning of the divisions, a mentioning of the divisions with the number of the books, a mentioning of the divisions or not a mentioning with the names of the books recorded, or quotations from these various books found. And then we'll know that we're talking about the self-same material. All right, the first of the witnesses we want to begin with is the Old Testament witness to itself. Since all the books weren't written in the same year, just because they're in the Old Testament, that doesn't mean anything. Since they were not all written in the same year, then books that chronologically come later than the Law of Moses can make references back to the Law of Moses, and therefore fill the place as an Old Testament witness of the Old Testament to itself. And that happens to be the place where we need to start, is the Old Testament law. We gave you dozens of references in OT Intro where the latter books in the Old Testament have reference back to Mosaic law, beginning with Joshua 1 and verse 8. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth. Joshua 1:8, right after the law of Moses. And the Old Testament is already witnessing to itself, that is, witnessing to an earlier portion of itself. Joshua coming right after Deuteronomy, but witnessing back to Genesis through Deuteronomy. 2 Kings 22, 8-11, Nehemiah 8, Malachi 4:4. We looked at dozens of references to the Old Testament by the Old Testament. That is, from a later portion looking back to an earlier portion. So that's, if you didn't know what a witness is, there is a witness of the Old Testament to the Old Testament concerning its canonical status. That whoever is living and writing in the time of Joshua 1:8 believes in the law of Moses because that's the law of God. And he's saying that this book is not to depart out of our mouth. So he believed it, in other words. That was part of their scriptures. The same is true as you work your way on down through the Old Testament. Then, we've got a long series of specific Old Testament witnesses to itself. 1 Kings recognizes the book of Joshua. We'll do which books recognize which other books. 1 Kings, and we'll have to look at these references, 16:34. Recognizes Joshua 6:26. How many of you even know what that's about there? You ought to know if you know your Old Testament real well. You're close to Rahab. We're a few verses after Rahab in Joshua 6. Okay, Jericho. Jericho, its rebuilding and so forth. 1 Kings 16:34. In his days did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord which he spake by Joshua the son of Nun. Joshua 6:26. And Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, Cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. Exactly paralleled in 1 Kings as we see the fulfillment of Joshua's curse, prophetic curse, here in Joshua chapter 6. So in other words, the writer of 1 Kings is recognizing the canonical status of the book of Joshua. And you see, we're not even out of the Old Testament yet. And the Old Testament is testifying and witnessing to itself. Then the book of Micah recognizes the book of Isaiah. Micah chapter 4 and verse 1 with Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 1. Now remember, we've just got a couple of years, about 4 years, separating the commencement of the ministries of Isaiah and Micah, 739, 735. Micah 4:1, But in the last days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow unto it. Isaiah 2:1, the word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. So it's Micah testifying to Isaiah and not the reverse, because it's the word that Isaiah saw, Isaiah 2:1 to begin with. And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. The same thing. Now, we've covered this before in Old Testament. They're not getting the same prophecy independent of one another. Micah has gotten the prophecy from Isaiah, who began his ministry several years before Micah, and as Isaiah 2:1 tells us, was the one who got the word from the Lord to begin with. And then Micah got it from him later on. And so Micah is testifying to the validity of the ministry of Isaiah the prophet. And therefore of Isaiah's book, since this was one of the portions of his oral prophecies that made it down into his writing. Jeremiah recognizes the book of Micah. In Jeremiah 26 and verse 18, with Micah 3 and verse 12. Jeremiah coming a century after Micah. Jeremiah 26:18. Micah the Morasthite prophesied in the days of Hezekiah, king of Judah, and spake to all the people of Judah, saying, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, Zion shall be plowed like a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the house as the high places of a forest. Then if you'll flip over to Micah 3:12, Therefore shall Zion for your sake be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become heaps, and the mountain of the house as the high places of the forest. In other words, we're just seeing quotations back and forth between these writers, but it's still all within the confines of the Old Testament. Then Daniel, you see we've had Micah recognizing Isaiah, then Jeremiah recognizing Micah, now Daniel recognizing Jeremiah. In Daniel 9, verses 1 and 2, Daniel said, I understood by the books that the years of our captivity would be 70 years. Jeremiah 25 and verse 11. This whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. And it shall come to pass, with verse 12, Jeremiah 25:12. And it shall come to pass that when these 70 years are accomplished, then I'll punish the king of Babylon, and that nation, saith the Lord, and their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it perpetual desolations. And so Daniel is witnessing to the prophecies of Jeremiah by saying that I understood from the books, evidently Jeremiah's book, in Daniel 9, verses 1 to 2, that our captivity, our exile would be for a period of 70 years. So he's testifying to the validity of what Jeremiah had said before, because it is fulfilled in exactly 70 years. Then Ezekiel recognizes not the prophecies, but the figures of Noah, Daniel, and Job. In chapter 14, verses 14, 16, 18, and 20. Then 2 Chronicles, chapter 36 and verse 21, clearly recognizes, again, Jeremiah, probably the same passage. 25, verses 11 and 12. Last chapter in 2 Chronicles, and verse 21. To fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths, for as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years, 70 years. The writer of Chronicles says this fulfills the word that Jeremiah had prophesied. So 2 Chronicles 36:21 with Jeremiah 25 verses 11 and 12. Then Ezra recognizes 2 Chronicles, Ezra 1 and verse 1 with 2 Chronicles 36:22. And Ezra recognizes Isaiah, same verse in Ezra with Isaiah 44:28. And he recognizes Jeremiah, same verse in Ezra with Jeremiah 27:22. All we need to see is Ezra 1:1. They're all saying what Ezra is saying here, or Ezra is saying what they have said earlier. The first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. Now this, remember, the first couple of verses of Ezra are simply a repetition of the last few verses in 2 Chronicles. So there is the witnessing from Ezra to 2 Chronicles. Now he's saying this is going to be fulfilled that was spoken from the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. So he's going to have reference to Jeremiah, which might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, which over in Isaiah 44 and verse 28 and Isaiah 45 verse 1 and verse 13, Isaiah refers to this king by name. And so Ezra, in other words, is testifying to the validity of 2 Chronicles, to Isaiah, and then to Jeremiah. Isaiah coming earliest, then Jeremiah, then 2 Chronicles, then Ezra. Now that's just a sampling of where, and those are the important samplings, not like we've got 10,000 more. There are others, but those are the most important samplings of the Old Testament witnessing to itself. Then if you'll look over, we're still under the Old Testament witness, to Zechariah chapter 7 and verse 12. Now this is a verse we've used before. Zechariah not mentioning by name, but nevertheless witnessing to the fact that God had given his word by means of prophets that came before him. So here we've got another vital witness of the Old Testament writers already testifying to the authority of the earlier writings that have come by other prophets. Because remember, Zechariah couldn't have all this memorized in 7 verse 12. Yea, they made their hearts as an adamant stone, lest they should hear the law and the words which the Lord of hosts hath sent in his Spirit by the former prophets. Now remember, Zechariah is not using this term former prophets in a technical sense. He's using it in a chronological sense, referring to all prophets who came formerly. In other words, those that came before him. Not former prophets versus latter prophets. And then, even more interesting than that is in the first chapter of his book. Let's see. Verse 3. We'll start with verse 3. Down through, I think, verse 6. Therefore say thou unto them, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, Turn ye unto me, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will turn to you, saith the Lord of hosts. Be ye not as your fathers, this is Zechariah prophesying, unto whom the former prophets have cried, saying, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, Turn ye now from your evil ways and from your evil doings, but they did not hear nor hearken unto me, saith the Lord. Now, which prophet do you think he's referring to? Well, which one is he not referring to? They all said, Turn unto me, saith the Lord, and I will turn unto you. So he's not referring to one particular prophet. Here is a witness for many, as a matter of fact, for all of the true prophets who came before him. He's not mentioning them by name because there are too many of them. But all of the prophets came before and said just what he's saying, Thus saith the Lord, Turn unto me, and I'll turn unto you. Your fathers, where are they? And the prophets, do they live forever? But my words and my statutes, which I commanded my servants the prophets, did they not take hold of your fathers? And they returned and said, Like as the Lord of hosts thought to do unto us, according to our ways and according to our doings, so hath he dealt with us. And we find them saying this after Babylonian captivity. God said he was going to do it. And sure enough, he did just what he said by the prophets he was going to do, because we didn't return unto him. Okay, we want to move on beyond that to an interesting subject, and that is the New Testament witness to the Old. Now, because we have the very words of the apostles and of Jesus himself recorded in the New Testament, then if we claim to be Christians, and a lot of people claim to be Christians and don't believe what I'm fixing to say, then we have to believe what they say about the Old Testament. If Jesus tells us that Isaiah said this, that Jeremiah said it, if the other apostles, the other New Testament writers are referring, and you know they do constantly, to the Old Testament writings, and I don't mean as a section writings, but all of the Holy Scriptures in the Old Testament, if they refer to that and tell us now this is done that this might be fulfilled, or this is according to what this prophet said, then we are bound by our Christian experience to believe that what they said is true. Now, you'd be surprised to find out how many people don't believe that. They don't like the references to the Old Testament that Jesus and the apostles are constantly making. Because all that is done and all that is said in the New Testament, all that is taught and all that is done, is based upon the Old Testament revelation. As a matter of fact, Jesus over in Luke 24:44 actually names by name all three Old Testament divisions, the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And he doesn't mention the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha there. So there is his approval on what he considered to be the Jewish Scriptures, those being the law, the prophets, and the writings, or the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And as Christians, we're bound to believe the same thing. It's just that many today choose not to believe the testimony that Jesus tells us when he said, now, Isaiah prophesied this. The first chapter that we come to in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, we're back to Isaiah and his prophecy, that we're going to have a child born by a virgin, and his name will be Emmanuel. Now, was it really a virgin birth? Well, the writer, Matthew, tells us that it was because it's on the basis of what Isaiah said. And you see, we as Christians use that as a proof text, and they'll say, well, no, it wasn't virgin born. We say, but Isaiah prophesied it. Well, it doesn't matter what Isaiah prophesied. Matthew, being a Jew, liked to look back to his Old Testament Jewish heritage, but that doesn't mean that what the prophet said was actually right. Doesn't mean they were inspired. Doesn't even mean the books were to be in the canon of Scripture. But obviously, as Christians, we are bound to believe what Jesus said and what the apostles said about the Old Testament. In Nessel's Greek Testament, he has an index at the end of his Greek Testament, Nessel's Greek Testament, where, according to his tabulation, he has 600 allusions, allusions to the Old Testament that are contained in the New. 250 of these being direct quotations of the Old Testament found in the New. Now, you'll find varying numbers, this 600 and 250, but Nessel's is an authority, so it doesn't matter if it's 610 and 247, it's still approximately right. 600 Old Testament allusions in the New Testament, 250 of which are strict quotations. And spread throughout these 250 quotations are all the books of the Old Testament with the exception of the following books: Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, the Song, Ecclesiastes, Ruth, Lamentations, and 3 minor prophets: Obadiah, Nahum, and Zephaniah. Quotations from all of the other books are found in the New Testament, excluding these. And the New Testament witness is that if you've got even one quotation from that book, then that one quotation represents, to those of us reading the quotation you give us, represents to us that whole book. We, in other words, don't just believe that one quotation that was quoted in the New from the Old and then say, well, I'm not going to believe anything else about that Old Testament book. If Jesus, in other words, quotes from Isaiah or quotes from Jeremiah, and it's already for 400 years prior to this been accepted by the Jews as a canonical book, then we are bound and expected to believe not only that one quotation, because after all, it'd only be one verse out of several hundred verses from that prophet or prophecy. We are bound to believe all that is written in that book, not just that one quotation. So Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, the Song, Ecclesiastes, Ruth, Lamentations, and 3 minor prophets, Obadiah, Nahum, and Zephaniah, all have quotations from their books in the New Testament. And of course, I'm giving you this because we're not going to go and look at all those. We could look at every one of those quotations, and that individually, each one individually, would be a witness to the Old Testament canon, at least a part of the Old Testament canon. So it's easier just to sum it all up rather than go and look at those 250 quotations. I don't know. It feels like we've left some of you anyway. But we do have a couple of texts we can give you in general. 2 Timothy 3:16. We're still in the easy teachings now. And 2 Peter 1:20-21. As well as, I think we've given you Hebrews 1:1 before. And then maybe a new passage, Romans 3, verses 1 and 2. Now these are passages that just kind of sum up Old Testament revelation, the Old Testament messengers of God. 2 Timothy 3:16, of course, talking about all Scripture given by inspiration. 2 Peter talking about those holy men of God that brought the Word not by their own will, but as the Holy Spirit carried them along. And that, of course, would refer to the Old Testament writings. What advantage then hath the Jew, or what profit is there of circumcision? Well, much every way, but chiefly because that unto them were committed the oracles of God.
Amen.
The oracles are the Old Testament books, the sacred scriptures. Unto the Jews their chief advantage, Paul says, over everyone else, is that unto them were committed the Holy Scriptures, that no other nation under heaven had been given. They had been given only to Israel, chiefly because that unto them were committed the oracles of God. So there are 3 or 4 passages. Hebrews 1, talking again about the prophets, Hebrews 1:1. There are 4 passages that just kind of sum up the New Testament witness to the Old Testament, and you put that with all those quotations, and you see that although we don't have quotations from some of these books we just mentioned, Jesus in Luke 24:44 still sums all of them up by law, prophets, and Psalms. Whatever was accepted by the Jews, which was the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, was accepted by Jesus as well. Therefore, in other words, you wouldn't need a quotation from Esther or Ezra or Nehemiah or Obadiah or Nahum or Zephaniah or Esther. You wouldn't need a direct quotation from these books because it's already been summed up in these verses that we've given you. Now, there's one important passage, well, it's 2 passages repeated over in Luke 11 that we want to look at that are going to give us another one of those very interesting things that you'll probably learn something from. Have you learned anything yet tonight? Okay, well, if you haven't, then you probably will here. Matthew 23:34 to 36, with Luke 11:49 to 51, with Zechariah 1:1, with 2 Chronicles 24:20 to 22. A little involved, to say the least. But I think that you'll all come to new understanding of this passage, and it's really been used in the past probably in an improper manner based on people's dependence on the Talmud as opposed to our dependence upon Josephus. Let's read the Luke account before the Matthew account. Same thing but said differently, and some points are made about the differences that lie between the two. Luke 11:49, therefore also, we're under New Testament witnesses to the Old Testament. Therefore also, said the wisdom of God, I will send them prophets and apostles, and some of them they shall slay and persecute, that the blood of all the prophets which was shed from the foundation of the world may be required of this generation, from the blood of Abel unto the blood of Zechariah, which perished between the altar and the temple. Verily I say unto you, it shall be required of this generation. Now he's making a great scan, either through history or through Old Testament biblical books. That's really the basic question that we're going to have to get to. Which of those two is he doing? But nevertheless, extending verse 51 from Abel to Zechariah. Zacharias is just the S over into the Greek from the Hebrew, but it's the same as Zechariah that you know in the Old Testament. The first A changed to an E. Who's he talking about? Zechariah. Who's he talking about? Whoever this Zechariah is, he was a martyr for the faith, just like Abel was. And not only was he a martyr, we're told in verse 51 that he perished between the altar and the temple. It's sometime whenever the altar is still standing, when the temple is still standing. And we know he's a prophet because he just said in verse 50 that the blood of all the prophets would be required of this generation. We know he's a prophet, but which one? Because it's going, verse 51, from the time of Abel to the time of whoever Zechariah is. And more importantly, he perishes between the altar and the temple. Now, if you go over to the account in Matthew, we're given one more detail. It's small, but nonetheless important. Important not because we can answer it right away, but because it brings all the problems up. No problem, in other words, with the way Luke says what he says. The problem only comes with Matthew 23 and not Luke 11. Verse 34. Wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify, and some of them shall ye scourge in your synagogues, and persecute them from city to city. Verse 35 is the important one. That upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. Now, we weren't told whose son he was in Luke's account. Whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. We found that same detail over in Luke. Verily I say unto you, all things shall come upon this generation. Now, let me see if I can state concisely what the problem is.
For the continuation of
We do have an Old Testament prophet by the name of Zechariah who perishes as a martyr between the temple and the altar. However, his father's name is Jehoiada. The Zechariah who has a father named Berechiah is the minor prophet Zechariah who wrote the book Zechariah. But nowhere in the Old Testament do we have any recordance of his being martyred between the temple and the altar. Now, you're all staring at me. Do I have to say that again, or did you get it? Or are you writing fast, or you got a tape player under the seat, or you got photographic memory, or what? We've got one Zechariah. We've got one Zechariah who's named Berechiah. This is what we're told here. His father's name's Berechiah. We're told in Matthew 23:35. We've got one. He's the minor prophet Zechariah, but we're not told he's martyred in the Old Testament. And more specifically, we're not told he's martyred between the temple and the altar. We couldn't be told that, obviously, if we're not told anything about his martyrdom. We do have a Zechariah who is murdered, just like this says, between the temple and the altar, but his father's name's not Berechiah. His father's name's Jehoiada. You never seen that before? Well, it pays to study the Scriptures, not read commentaries and Sunday school lessons. Let's see. Does it give us a reference there? Oh, it goes to 2 Chronicles. All right. Now, where does your reference go? 2 Chronicles 24, 20 to 22. Fine. Except that Zechariah's father there is named Jehoiada, not Berechiah. And it's not like just a mistake has been made, because we actually do have these two Zechariahs. One of them martyred, one of them not. But one of them has Jehoiada for his father, one of them has Berechiah for his father. In other words, what appears to have taken place, so the liberals tell us, is just mass confusion here. Someone didn't know what they were talking about. They gave us the account of the martyrdom of one Zechariah, but got confused and gave us the pedigree of another Zechariah. And, of course, that is a great hurt to the biblical view of the inspiration of Scriptures. Because whoever's getting it wrong, it doesn't make any difference. They're confused about their account. They've got one Zechariah, and they've got him confused with another Zechariah. Not hard to do, seeing that there are at least 25 Zechariahs in the Old Testament. Here are the possible solutions that we have to this problem. Do you all see the problem so far? Okay, so we've got three possible solutions. Number one, this is kind of difficult to go through this, so I'll try to say it slowly enough. Jesus never said the Father's name, according to Luke 11:51. All he said is just Zechariah. He never said the Son up. So one solution is Jesus never said the Father's name, but it was later inserted by a copyist in Matthew's account. Now that doesn't hurt inspiration of Scripture, assuming that Jesus and Matthew and Luke were all right. They all said the right thing, and it was some later copyist that got the accounts of which Zechariah was being referred to mixed up and got the wrong father's name in for the wrong prophet in Matthew 23. That's one solution. A second solution is that Jesus did say the correct father's name, which obviously would had to have been Jehoiada, but was later corrupted through transmission, either by Matthew or a later copyist. So in either account, the name Berechiah should not be here. The first solution, we said Jesus never gave the Father's name. And someone who was copying Matthew here remembered the story about Zechariah and got the Zechariahs confused and put in the wrong Father's name. Then the second solution is that Jesus did say the Father's name, and he said the right name, which would have had to have been Jehoiada, since that matches the story in 2 Chronicles 24, verses 20 to 22. But it was later corrupted by transmission, either by the hand of Matthew or by some later copyist. Now, if it was Matthew, then you have a liberal view of the inspiration of Scripture. Matthew forgot his account. He forgot what Jesus said, or he forgot the story himself. If it's a later copyist, then we don't have a problem. We've still got, just like we have to change things, as we're always doing in King James Version, we've got something that has to be changed, something that shouldn't be here. Then we've got a third solution. That Jesus did say the correct Father's name, and that was Berechiah. Now you see, the first two solutions are good because they don't give us a problem. They keep it, in other words, in accordance with the Old Testament. This third solution brings a problem because we're told that Jesus does give us the correct Father's name, and that name is not Jehoiada, but Berechiah. In other words, Matthew 23:35 should read just like Matthew 23:35 reads. Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. And then there are two different views under this solution. There's what we might call the traditionally accepted view and the alternative view. And obviously, it's only a pick between the minor prophet Zechariah and the 2 Chronicles 24:20 to 22 prophet Zechariah. So the traditional view tells us that Jesus had reference to the prophet in 2 Chronicles 24. Now, before we go on, let's go over and read the passage to make sure that you're following along in what I've said, and now you'll be able to see it yourself. Matthew 23:35, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, first two A's in Berechiah would be an E in the Old Testament, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. Zechariah, son of Berechiah, was a martyr and died between the temple and the altar. Okay, with that in mind, 2 Chronicles 24:20. And the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest, which stood above the people, and said unto them, Thus saith God, Why transgress ye the commandments of the Lord, that ye cannot prosper? Because ye have forsaken the Lord, he hath also forsaken you. And they conspired against him, and stoned him with stones at the commandment of the king in the court of the house of the Lord, between the temple and the altar, the court of the house of the Lord. Who is it? Zechariah. Who's his father? Jehoiada. Thus Joash the king remembered not the kindness which Jehoiada his father had done unto him, but slew his son. And when he died, he said, The Lord look upon it and require it. Okay, and I think we need to look at the minor prophet Zechariah 1:1, just to show you this is there in the Old Testament. Zechariah 1:1. In the 8th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, came the word of the Lord unto Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. Now there's Berechiah. And this is an entirely different prophet. We're many years after what's being recorded back there. We're hundreds of years after what's being recorded back there in 2 Chronicles 24. Two Zechariahs, two different fathers. So obviously two different prophets. Okay, back to our views. The third solution was that Jesus did say the correct father's name, and that name was Berechiah. The traditional view under this solution tells us that Jesus had reference to the prophet in 2 Chronicles 24. Now remember, this is a view, it's the traditionally accepted view. This is a view that does fit under this third solution, although you might not be able to see how yet. Because the third solution tells us that Jesus did say the right name, but he said Berechiah, and not Jehoiada, which is what 2 Chronicles 24 tells us. But according to this traditional view, they believe that Jesus still had reference to the 2 Chronicles 24 prophet and not to the minor book of Zechariah prophet. And they've got several faults under this view, beginning with, number one, they tell us, according to common Jewish practice in genealogies, many times the father's name can be left out and the grandfather's name given. In other words, Jehoiada in 2 Chronicles 24 was really the grandfather of Zechariah, and they simply skipped over the father's name, which was Berechiah. Now, we showed you in some messages in creation, that's done all the time in the Old Testament. They skip over several generations and still call them father and son, and mother and daughter, although they're separated maybe by several hundred years, or at the least by a generation, from grandfather to grandson, from grandson back to grandfather. And so here, we keep the name Berechiah in Matthew 23:35, but we don't go to the minor prophet, we go to 2 Chronicles 24. And what they tell us is that when he refers to him in verse 20 as Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, he means Zechariah, the descendant of Jehoiada. Can that be done? Well, obviously that can be. We have shown you before that is done on many occasions in the Old Testament, that they don't mean the first descendant. They might mean a second or a third or a fourth or perhaps just a distant descendant. So that's one thought in support of this traditional view. Then in the second place, still under the traditional view, but another thought that goes along with this, is that they assume Jesus has reference to all martyrs from the beginning of the Old Testament canon to the end. Remember, the first prophet mentioned there is Abel. The first book in the Jewish canon is Genesis. The last book in the Jewish canon today is 2 Chronicles. And what are we looking at? 2 Chronicles 24. The prophet Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, the son of Jehoiada. And so they're saying what Jesus has reference to when he talks about his requiring their blood upon this generation is that group of prophets that spanned from the beginning of the Jewish canon to the end. From the first book in the Jewish canon, Genesis, to the last book in the Jewish canon, 2 Chronicles, which is the way it is today. Then in the third place, they tell us that the dying words of the prophet in 2 Chronicles 24:22, which would refer to Zechariah's death, tied in with Abel's death, Genesis 4:10, seem to be what Luke 11:50 has reference to. Now we'll have to look at all three of these passages. Second Chronicles 24:22, the dying words of this prophet, along with the words after Abel's martyrdom in Genesis 4:10, would be what Jesus is referring to in Luke 11:50. Second Chronicles, we'll start with that passage, 24:22. And when he died, he said, "The Lord look upon it and require it." Okay, Genesis 4, verse 10. God said, "What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground." All right, Luke 11 and verse 50. It's all about the blood, of these prophets. The blood of all the prophets, which was shed from the foundation of the world, may be required. The very word used in 2 Chronicles 24:22. may be required of this generation. And so you see they say that Jesus here in Luke 11:50 has reference to Genesis 4, Abel's death, obviously has reference to it, but to those particular words and to the particular words of the dying prophet Zechariah in 2 Chronicles 24:22. Now that's the traditional view. Let's, in the second place, go to an alternative view. Still under this third solution that Jesus did say the correct father's name, and that name was not Jehoiada, but Berechiah. Okay, obviously, if the traditional view tells us that Jesus is referring back to the Zechariah of 2 Chronicles 24, then the alternative view is that Jesus is referring back to the minor prophet Zechariah. I mean, those are the two that are under discussion. And they've got several thoughts that go under this view as well. Number one, we have to remind ourselves, I better say this is my thought, this is not other thoughts because I haven't read it anywhere, but you know it because we've taught it to you before. We have to remind ourselves that the Jewish canon of Scripture today is in essence substantially that of the Talmud, whereas Josephus' canon is an entirely different canon because he arranges the books by means of a different system of classification. In other words, the argument that Jesus is talking about from the first book of the Old Testament canon to the end may not really hold water when we find out that 2 Chronicles really was not the last book in the Old Testament canon. You see, that's only according to the canon since the days of the Talmud until our time. But what about Josephus' 5:13:4 division? Where would 2 Chronicles be? It wouldn't be in that last section of 4. It would be back there with the 13, which means that it couldn't possibly be the last book of the Old Testament canon. Therefore, that second point under the traditional view really doesn't hold much water. And the problem is most people lean to the Talmud and completely obscure any references to Josephus by telling us that that was a peculiarity of his own, making his 5:13:4 division and taking books like Chronicles and putting it back in the prophets and leaving us with only those 4 books that are in that final division. All right, a second thing, back to Matthew 23, is that evidently from the language of Matthew 23:35, Jesus has reference to all the prophets not who span the gap from the first canonical book to the last canonical book, but from the beginning of Old Testament history to the end of Old Testament history. In other words, it's a chronological statement and not a logical one from one book to the next book. Now you see if this is not true here in Matthew 23 and verse 35. The language indicates that Jesus probably was talking about all martyrs from the beginning of Old Testament times to the end, rather than from the first to the last book, because we just saw before, if Josephus' method of division is correct, which Luke 24:44 points toward, since Jesus calls that last division Psalms. And it would be interesting if we've only got 4 books there, rather than all those other ones that the Talmud has, then most definitely he would refer to that division as Psalms, because that's the big book, that's the important book, and the other ones are written by David or Solomon anyway. So that would make a lot of sense. But here in verse 35, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth. He's talking about a period of time and not canonical books. From the blood of righteous Abel, which not the beginning of the Old Testament, but the beginning of Old Testament times, unto the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, not to the end of the Old Testament, but to the end of Old Testament times, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar. Over in Jeremiah 26 and verse 23, we actually have a martyrdom, the martyrdom of Urijah the prophet, which chronologically was later than 2 Chronicles 24. However, it would have been quite a bit earlier than our minor prophet's time, minor prophet Zechariah the son of Berechiah. In other words, based on that text, we won't look at it, but you can write it down, Jeremiah 26:23, if Jesus is saying here, according to the traditionally accepted view, Matthew 23:35, that the blood of these prophets from the beginning of the Jewish canon to the end of the Jewish canon will be required on this generation, it's really an incomplete statement, since after the time of this prophet, Zechariah, in 2 Chronicles 24, we have a later martyrdom, and that is of Urijah in Jeremiah 26. In other words, you left out the picture. You don't have a complete picture of the blood of all the prophets that were slain in the Old Testament, unless you go from the beginning of Old Testament times to the end of Old Testament times. If you do it from first canonical book, Genesis, to last one, 2 Chronicles, you're still leaving out Urijah. And therefore, you've really got an incomplete statement in Matthew 23 and verse 35. However, Urijah's martyrdom in Jeremiah 26 would have come quite a bit before Zechariah, son of Berechiah, the minor prophet, if in fact he was ever martyred, which would fit this theory, the alternative theory, rather than the traditional one. Okay, in the third place, with Jesus and Matthew both obviously knowing the ambiguity of the situation, they probably would not have said son of Berechiah if they did not have reference to our minor prophet Zechariah. In other words, it would have been much easier for them just to follow what the Old Testament had already said and say son of Jehoiada, even if Jehoiada's grandfather and not father of that Zechariah in 2 Chronicles 24, to make sure we realize he's talking about that Zechariah in 2 Chronicles 24 and not the minor prophet. It's an ambiguous statement to say son of Berechiah, since whoever's saying this, Jesus and then Matthew writing it, is going to know right away that when you turn to your Old Testament, the only Zechariah son of Berechiah is the minor prophet, and it's not going to fit what I'm saying here, or it's not going to fit what I'm writing here. And so, in other words, if he would have meant the other prophet, it would have been a lot easier to say Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. Then we'd know which one he's talking about. We would know that he's talking about that 2 Chronicles 24 one. Even if Jehoiada was grandfather and not father, we would still know, because he would simply be recording that in light of what the Old Testament had said, and wouldn't be trying to tell us now, wait a minute, really his father was Zechariah and his grandfather was Jehoiada. That wouldn't make any difference. As long as he names Jehoiada, we know who he's talking about. But since he names Berechiah, then he must have reference to the prophet who had a father whose name was Berechiah. Now these are the, three solutions? And then two views under the last solution. Which of these theories is correct? I mean, all of them are theories except one, and that's the correct one. The idea of the first and last book in the canon is a very inviting idea, because we know that today the Bible starts with Genesis and ends with Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. That's a very inviting idea. It's a very inviting statistic to bring before us, except for the fact that Josephus evidently had a different arrangement. And Josephus was the time of Jesus and not the Talmud, or not the Jewish way of setting their Old Testament up today. So although that's inviting at first glance, on second thought, it's not so good after all. Another point that is made is the age of the prophet, or of the priest Jehoiada in 2 Chronicles 24. He lives to be a great age, I think like 130. And according to the traditional view, with him being the grandfather, that would fit very well. Therefore, you would have more time between the grandfather and the grandson, since the grandfather lived to be 130, as opposed just to the father and the son. A father who's 130 and a son, Zechariah, who's just a young man at this time. So that would fit the traditional view as opposed to the alternative view. Now, as I mentioned before, there are at least 25 persons in the Old Testament with the name of Zechariah. So we need to say right off the bat that it's a very, very common Old Testament name. It would have been easy for two of these people named Zechariah to have a father by the same name, Berechiah, even if Jehoiada was the grandfather. And we end up with two prophets who have a father whose name is Berechiah. That's certainly possible. However, remembering the ambiguity of the situation, probably Jehoiada was really the father of that Zechariah and not the grandfather. Now, if he is, then that ruins the traditionally accepted view. If he isn't, then of course we've still got many more problems on our hands. The only prophet, according to the Old Testament, who dies by martyrdom, who has a name of Zechariah, and it's between the temple and the altar, is the 2 Chronicles 24 prophet. And after all, that's what Matthew 23:35 is all about. It doesn't matter who the father is. The point he's trying to make is their martyrdom. And the Zechariah that we know from the Old Testament who suffered martyrdom was the Zechariah of 2 Chronicles 24. And it even tells us that he perished in the court of the house of the Lord. I mean, it's real specific. So which of these views do we accept? Well, I don't think it's really that difficult. I think that the alternative view is really the only biblically acceptable view, because it names the father as Berechiah, and if, as we said earlier, he's really referring to the 2 Chronicles 24 prophet, then why not tell us Jehoiada as the father or as the grandfather? Either way, it'll help us understand. If you're saying Berechiah, and there's only one Zechariah in the Old Testament whose father's name is Berechiah, then evidently you expect us to just assume that it's the prophet that we know of as Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, which would be the minor prophet. Now, there would be nothing difficult at all for the martyrdom of Zechariah, the minor prophet, to have occurred in the same place and in the same manner as the earlier Zechariah did. And Jesus and Matthew at this time would have known that by Jewish tradition, although it's not in the Old Testament, and would have expected his listeners. You see, who he's talking to now, they don't fight with him over Zechariah, son of Berechiah. They understand what he's saying. And you say, well, what about us today? Well, then he would expect us not to know Jewish tradition, but to believe what Matthew 23:35 said. And if you take just Matthew 23:35, he tells us it was Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. If that's all you take, you end up with Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. Now, when you compare that to the Old Testament, that's only one Zechariah. And if a person says, well, it doesn't tell us that he got martyred, that's right, but it doesn't tell us that he didn't either. And since he expects us to believe that what he says is true, we'd have to assume that that did take place. So what you would have would be the martyrdom of two prophets named Zechariah, one of them with a father whose name was Jehoiada, the other one with a father whose name was Berechiah, who lived several hundred years from each other in time, but who both were martyred for their prophecies and for their stand on the word of Yahweh, and who were both martyred in the same place, the court of the Lord's house between the temple and the altar. Because remember, by the time of Zechariah, they've got the temple built now. You're going to have an altar there, and it was sometime after the book of Zechariah was written. Obviously, he couldn't have been dead and still writing the prophecy. Sometime later in his life, when he was martyred, just like the earlier Zechariah was. This is really the only conclusion that you can come to without jumping into these muddy waters that we've been helping you muddy up some more by discussing them tonight. Because you end up with having to say that, well, there's no way we can really know what Jesus is talking about, since he's misleading us, one, by the fellow's name, but two, by his experience. And they don't match according to the Old Testament. Unless you assume what we've said before, that the language of Matthew 23, 34, and 35 is from the beginning of Old Testament days to the end of them, and not from the beginning of the canon to the end. That way, you'll be talking about Zechariah, and he's one of the last prophets. He's living same time or just a little bit before Malachi. He was one of the last prophets, and probably he was the last Old Testament prophet that was martyred. That would take us from the first one in time, not in canon, but in time, Abel, to the last one, who would have been Zechariah. And he would have been martyred, and it just happened to be that he was martyred in the same place as an earlier Zechariah was. But seeing Israel's hatred for the word of Yahweh and those prophets who stood too strongly upon it, that's not hard to believe that these prophets would have had something to do in and around the temple, since that's where the worship of God was centered, and then that's where they would have been killed as well. So what this turns out to be then is really not a great New Testament witness for the Old Testament canon. We mentioned it here so you'd understand what it's talking about, and because a lot of others use this as being a good New Testament witness to the Old by saying, here in one verse, we have all the Old Testament books from Genesis to 2 Chronicles. When in fact, as we've shown you, he's probably not talking about the canon because the last book was probably not 2 Chronicles, not in their Jewish Bible of that day. So it becomes really not a very good New Testament witness for the Old.
For a complete list